Now we have our guest presenter today, Paul Halpern. So he's the professor of physics at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia, the author of 16 popular science books, including The Quantum Labyrinth, Einstein's Dice, and Schrodinger's Cat. He's a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Fulbright Scholarship, and is a fellow at the American Physical Society. He has spoken in person to another number of humanist and free thought groups, including the Philadelphia Ethical Society, Philadelphia Association of Critical Thinking, the Allentown Free Thought Society, and most importantly, he's spoken at LVH once before, at least once. And today he's going to be discussing his book, Synchronicity, the epic quest to understand the quantum nature of cause and effect. So without further ado, I'm going to mute my mic and let Paul take over.
Thank you. Please all mute your mics except for me. I really thank Bill and the LVH for inviting me. It's nice to be back, a little bit different than last time, because last time I had to drive all the way up the northeast extension of the turnpike and find your location. And now I'm just in my office, but really glad to see you all and to be back. So today I'm going to be talking about my latest book, which is my 16th book. I've been writing for 30 years now. My first book came out in 1990, Time Journeys. And this is my latest, which is Synchronicity. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about different characters in physics and how they connected with psychologists. So you should all be seeing my screen now with my talk, hopefully.
Right.
Great. Anyway, so the book is called Synchronicity, the Epic Quest to Understand the Quantum Nature of Cause and Effect. That's a lot of technical stuff, but let me explain what it is. Oops. So first of all, let's start with somebody who I spoke about the last time I was in the LVH, and you all are familiar with, Albert Einstein. Now, we all know about Albert Einstein's revolutionary contributions. He was, of course, the father of relativity, the idea that space and time are connected to each other, that you can turn space into time and time to space, and that E equals mc squared, energy and matter are related to each other. So you could take a clump of material and turn it into energy. You can fuel things with it. And that's how nuclear power works. So his contributions were astronomical in importance. He also contributed to what's called quantum mechanics. Now, quantum mechanics might not be familiar to all of you. Quantum means a small quantity. And when Einstein started delving into quantum mechanics, the idea was that energy comes in small packets. It's not continuous. So instead of light shining on something continuously, light is really made up of little bits, little pieces or packets, and it's absorbed one at a time. And that explains certain features in nature that weren't explained before. It also led eventually to new developments such as the photoelectric effect and modern electronic cameras. So if you take a picture with a cell phone or a camera, the light is coming in and then registering and turning into an electric signal that we can attribute to Einstein. We can thank Einstein for that. Now, even though Einstein started off the quantum revolution and he was involved in it for about 20 years, suddenly in the mid-1920s, he began to balk at the direction the revolution was taking. So the revolution got out of control from his perspective. So why was he balking? And one of the reasons was, he said famously, to paraphrase a quote, he said, "The Lord, meaning nature, does not play dice with the universe." So when Einstein spoke of God or the Lord, he meant the force of nature, or nature's rules is how he saw the divine does not play dice with the universe, meaning there can't be any randomness in the universe. And that's the direction that quantum mechanics was moving in. Quantum mechanics was trying to say that certain things don't happen automatically, but rather happen with a certain amount of chance, a certain amount of luck. Kind of like a casino, that you don't know automatically if you're going to win a prize. You have a certain chance. And quantum mechanics tells you what are the chances that a particle might be in a certain location. You don't know exactly where it is. You know the chance of where it will be in a certain location. And Einstein didn't like that idea. Now, he took that idea from a philosopher, a Dutch philosopher named Baruch Spinoza, also known as Benedict Spinoza, which is a Latinization of his name. And this Dutch Jewish philosopher said that God, he equated with the force of nature, and basically that nature had no control, no decision making, that nature was automatic, that there was some best scenario for the world, a best of all possible worlds, and that nature must adopt that, because otherwise, why would nature choose something that's less than best? So that means that everything that happens is contingent on everything else that happens. So as in Spinoza's words, in nature, there's nothing contingent, but everything is determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. Einstein was very influenced by that, and he said, my views are very near to those of Spinoza, admiration for the beauty of and belief in the logical simplicity of the order and harmony, which we can grasp humbly and only imperfectly. So Einstein really felt that nature set certain laws from the very beginning and must follow those laws, can't deviate. Therefore, chance does not enter into the picture, because how could nature roll dice and decide something? There must be an absolute decision making that happens, which is basically the best scenario that can happen. So this leads to what we can call a clockwork universe. Now, Einstein was not the first to come up with a clockwork universe. That goes back to ideas of Isaac Newton before him. Isaac Newton's laws tell you that if you know the universe at any particular time, let's say you know the universe a billion years ago, and then you apply the laws of mechanics, you can predict exactly what will happen anytime in the future. So if you were around a billion years ago and you knew the position of every single particle in the universe, and you knew the speed of every single particle in the universe, and you knew the forces on every single particle in the universe, those things, hypothetically, you could predict exactly what would happen into the future. You could, in theory, predict that I would be giving this talk today if you knew everything. And you could predict what will happen in the next election. You could predict everything you want because the particles must move according to certain rules. So following the rules, there is only one possible outcome every second. Following that for billions of years, there's only one possible future of the universe. Einstein believed that too. So even though he was a revolutionary, he borrowed that idea from Newton. And that also is connected with something called the law of causality, cause and effect. Every effect stems from a cause. And that's what Einstein believed in, that if you have an effect, you must have a known cause. And there's a certain time lag, Einstein said, between the cause and the effect. So one difference between Newton and Einstein is that Newton didn't really say how long it would take for a cause to produce an effect. Einstein did. He said causes create effects at the speed of light or less. So the speed of light is very, very fast, but that sets the upper limit for cause and effect. You can't have an effect that happens before light can travel from one place to another. So for example, on Earth, we're about 4 light years, which meaning it would take 4 years for light to pass to the closest star other than the sun, which is called Proxima Centauri, near Alpha Centauri. And we think that there's a planet there. So if something happened on the planet near Proxima Centauri a minute from now, it couldn't possibly be caused by something from Earth. If it happened a month from now, it couldn't possibly be caused by something from Earth. Only if it happened 4 years from now, then it could be caused by something on Earth. So if there was somebody on Proxima Centauri right now giving this exact same lecture and looked like me, it wouldn't be because they're copying me. It would be just coincidence, strangely enough. I don't believe that's the case, but it would be coincidence. But if something happened 8 years from now, then we would know that a signal could pass from us to Proxima Centauri, and they could be copycats. So that's how causality works. Now, quantum mechanics also veers away from the idea that things take time to travel. There's something called quantum entanglement. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but basically it says that two particles can have a connection in space in which if you do something to one particle, something happens to the other particle instantly, because those particles share a quantum state. A quantum state can be indefinitely large. So if there was a quantum state that linked two planets, then you could change one particle and the other particle would instantly change. So that Einstein found that very strange. He called that spooky action at a distance. And he told quantum physicist Max Born, I cannot seriously believe in quantum mechanics because it can't be reconciled with the idea that physics should represent a reality in space and time free from spooky actions at a distance. So that was Einstein's second criticism of quantum mechanics. The first criticism was he didn't like randomness. The second criticism was he didn't like things that can happen instantly from one place to another. Now, the term spooky is very interesting because it sounds like something mysterious. It sounds almost like the paranormal, the supernatural. Now, Einstein did not believe in the supernatural or the paranormal, yet he was often asked about it. People often mistake science for pseudoscience. As I'm sure you've discussed in your group, a lot of times people think that something is science when it's really pseudoscience. The difference has to do with experimentation. Now, in Einstein's time, there are many different groups that were experimenting with the paranormal, trying to talk about psychic phenomena, even trying to understand psychic phenomena using experiments, but these were not reproducible experiments. And a lot of people asked Einstein all the time, does relativity have anything to do with ghosts? Does relativity have to do with the hereafter? And Einstein would kind of throw up his hands and say, like, well, that's not my business. It has nothing to do with relativity. But he was often asked about this by different people. So it could be that his use of the term was trying to distance himself with the paranormal and say, look, physics should be scientific. It should not have any pseudoscientific elements. And if things happen over a distance in quantum mechanics, for Einstein, that said, look, there must be a problem. You must have something going on that we can't see. So Einstein believed that there was something hidden, something that was connecting two distant things in quantum mechanics, that you couldn't have immediate action at a distance. So this even made Einstein's attacks even made the New York Times. In 1935, New York Times headline, Einstein attacks quantum theory. And that was based on a paper he wrote with his assistants, Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen. And it's also called the EPR thought experiment, and trying to show that quantum mechanics has contradictions. But the quantum mechanics people did not believe him. The mainstream quantum mechanics people said, look, all these experiments show that you do have these entanglement effects. Einstein's wrong, not us. Now, in psychology, there's also a kind of determinism. So just like Newtonian determinism, where if you predict something using forces, you can predict something indefinitely into the future. Psychic determinists think that if you know everything about somebody's mind at one point, you can predict what they'll be thinking. And what they'll be thinking is not always manifest in what they say, but might be in something called, as Freud said, the unconscious mind. So Freud believed that you have conscious mind and an unconscious mind, and that the unconscious mind harbors all these events that happened in the past in a kind of deterministic way. And that if you dream something, if you say something, that it probably reflects upon something that happened to you in your early childhood. Maybe something that happened with your parents was a typical theme that Freud brought up. So Freud talked about slips of the tongue, the famous Freudian slip. So here's a cartoon about that. A Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but you mean your mother. I mean another. So if you make a mistake, Freud thought, well, it probably means something in the past. Now, he did at one point admit that sometimes if you could accidentally slip up and it has nothing to do with your past, but he wasn't an absolute determinist, but he really thought that if you said something, it reflected upon your past. And here's a little iceberg model of Freudian psychology. The underlying part is the unconscious, and what is manifest is a conscious mind. And Einstein, similarly, even though they never worked together, Freud and Einstein, believed that the laws of physics had some deep roots that you can't see, that quantum mechanics had some kind of submerged part that was going on behind the scenes, and we just see what's going on above the water. And that's why quantum mechanics seems spooky, but it really has all this stuff going on underneath. Now, a physicist named John Bell in 1960 showed that you can prove whether or not there's something going on behind the scene. It's called Bell's inequality, and you can apply that test to quantum mechanics. You can apply it to every experiment, and you can see whether or not something could be going on behind the scene. Bell thought there was something going on behind the scene, but when you apply his test to an experiment, it shows no, there must be entanglement, there must be action at a distance. So Einstein ultimately was wrong. And in terms of Freud was not quite the same scientific in the same way. He based ideas on his own experience with his patients, but a lot of people don't necessarily believe in his model today. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about two rebels. One physicist who rebelled against Einsteinian standard of determinism, and a psychologist who rebelled against Freudian psychology. Both of them had in common that they believed that things can happen over a distance, that things can happen in space that are connected and don't necessarily have a causal relationship. Now, the guy on the left is named Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli is the pronunciation of his name in German. You could say Pauli, but the correct pronunciation is Pauli. And he was born in Vienna, and he's sometimes nicknamed the second Einstein, or Zweistein in German. Zwei means two, and Stein means stone, and eins means one. So it's, if you count in German, you have eins zwei, so that's why his name is Schweizstein. Anyway, he was so bright that at the age of 20, he was already being heralded as a wunderkind, or a boy genius. He wrote the definitive article on relativity when he was about 20 years old, which brought him the attention of many, many physicists around the world. And Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst. He started off as a disciple of Freud, but then he started to look at a new direction, something he called archetypes and the collective unconscious. The idea that things in the unconscious mind are not necessarily from the person's past, from their childhood, but rather are connected to things in culture and things that might have happened elsewhere in space or elsewhere in time. That perhaps something that happened to the ancient Egyptians has been passed along and resonates. So maybe a symbolism, let's say symbolism of the feminine or the masculine, has been part of the human collective unconsciousness for years. Now, whether or not this relates to science is a big question, because Jung based this on his therapeutic experience. He did not try to scientifically test this idea. A lot of modern psychologists use things like double-blind studies, where you have studies with a lot of people and you don't know who the patients are. The patients don't know who's testing them. And you have all sorts of control groups and things like that. That's the way modern scientific psychology works, with lots and lots of testing and large numbers of subjects, I should point out. But anyway, in those days, the psychology was based upon direct experience with patients. Now, Jung knew Einstein. When Einstein worked in Zurich in the early 1910s, Jung lived in Zurich, and two of them had dinner together. Now, this is not an actual photo. This is from a TV series some of you may have seen called Genius, which was about the life of Einstein. And this is a reenactment, I should say, of Jung meeting Einstein, because there's no photos of Jung with Einstein. And during those dinners, Jung started to become interested in relativity, this idea that space and time is flexible. And Jung differed from Einstein. He thought, well, maybe you have connections that are faster than light. Now, Einstein never ruled out the idea of faster than light connections. He just did not follow through on an implication of his work. General relativity allows for these. General relativity says that space and time can be connected in many, many different ways. So, in principle, Einstein's theory can allow for faster than light connections in space. So, Jung's ideas led him to the idea of non-locality, that things could be connected over large distances, and that's where he came up with collective unconsciousness. Now, in the particle world, that's entanglement. But that, I should mention, entanglement is something that has been verified in the particle world. Once again, collective unconsciousness is an idea that Jung had that has not been verified scientifically. Now, Pauli, surprisingly, was a very hard-headed physicist, even though later he became involved with Jung as a collaborator. He was a hard-headed physicist and a very sensitive soul. So other physicists thought of him as brilliant, but he was also known as being very, very critical. Pauli would go to a seminar and attack the speaker. If I were delivering this talk now and Pauli were in the audience, I'd be terrified, because during the question and answer session, he would probably find some way of making fun of me or criticizing me. He would do that with everyone, so people were used to that. One of his most famous expressions is that a theory was so incorrect that it was not even wrong. It was beyond incorrect. He also criticized Einstein. Even though he was a disciple of Einstein, he would look at Einstein's attempts to go beyond quantum physics and unify the forces of nature, and he would criticize them. one after another, because Einstein kept coming up with ideas. And one time Einstein said, "You were right after all, you rascal." He admitted that Pauli was right about the ideas, even though Einstein would resist for a while. Now, Pauli was famous for Nobel Prize-winning research, the discovery of the neutrino, which is a lightweight particle, and also this idea called the exclusion principle. And let me explain that a little bit. If you have two particles like electrons, which are a negatively charged particle, subatomic particle, there must be something different about them. They can't be in the exact same quantum state. And the thing that's different about them is something called spin. If you have a particle that seems to be spinning counterclockwise, the other one in the same state must be seeming to be spinning clockwise. If something's spinning counterclockwise, then its magnetic axis points up. If something's spinning clockwise, its magnetic axis points down relative to turning on a magnet. So the way you can determine spin is you turn on a magnet, you put the particle in. If the particle flips up, it's an up spin. If the particle flips down, it's a down spin. Now the particles, mind you, aren't really spinning. It's just a way of looking at the quantum state. If they were actually spinning, they would be spinning faster than the speed of light. So they aren't really actually spinning. They're just acting like they're spinning, which is a little bit strange, but quantum mechanics has some very unintuitive rules. And one rule is that if you have two electrons in the same quantum state, one of them must have its spin axis pointing up, the other must have its spin axis pointing down automatically. And that's called the Pauli exclusion principle, because you can't have two spin up particles in the same state. They're excluded. That's where the word exclusion comes from. Now, Pauli turned to Carl Jung as a therapist after a series of events that affected his life. As I said, he was very sensitive. In around the late 1920s, his father had an affair and his mother committed suicide. And he was very close to his mother. He was very disturbed by that. And then a couple years later, he got married to a cabaret dancer named Katie. And she, at the time, was in love with a chemist, but she still agreed to get married to him. So he thought, okay, I'm all set. She broke off with the chemist, and now we can get married. But she continued to see the chemist secretly. And then he kind of found out about it. And then finally, she wanted to get divorced. She wanted to go off with the chemist. And he was really upset. He said, had she taken a bullfighter, I would have understood, but such an ordinary chemist. He just couldn't understand why someone would ditch a physicist to go off with a chemist. And at that time, he began to drink very heavily, and he felt like he was hopeless with women. And he wrote to Jung on his father's advice. Jung said, well, I have this young woman therapist that I want you to see. Not me, but I want you to see a woman therapist because your problems are with women. So you should see Erna Rosenbaum. So for a few months, he went to Erna Rosenbaum and got therapeutically advised by her. And basically she just said, tell me about your dreams. Tell me about your dreams. And she wrote down all of his dreams. And then finally she said, look, you're getting pretty good at this. You can write down your own dreams. So he began to get into the habit of writing down his dreams. And he had more than 1,000 dreams. And Jung had access to these dreams too, because he would have access to the therapeutic notes. And eventually he met with Pauli too. And the dreams were full of symbolism. For example, one dream he had was about a world clock with 4 figures rotating around in a circle, kind of like a German glockenspiel, or a clock which had a little play that happens once an hour where you have these figures coming out. He had a dream something like that, only it was a circle within a circle, 4 figures on top of a bird, and he called it a world clock. That was an example of one of his dreams. Now, note the number 4. He believed that all his dreams are full of numerical symbolism, and he thought the number 4 was very, very significant numerologically. So even though he was a hard-headed scientist, he began to believe in numerology, that numbers were important in and of themselves, not because of scientific meaning. Soon, because of sharing his dreams, he felt healed. He began to drink less, and he met a woman that he got married to named Franca, or Francisca Bertram. And they got married in 1933. And we see a little bit of a resemblance to his own mother. This is a picture of Pauli as a child with his mother. This is a picture of Pauli as an adult with his wife. So I find this really a bit amusing. Freud would have a field day with that. Not necessarily Jung. But anyway, but Pauli was happily married, and he continued to converse with Jung, mostly discussing ideas. In the late 1940s, after World War II, they began to collaborate regularly. And this became connected with synchronicity, which was Jung's term for an acausal connecting principle. So Jung coined the term synchronicity. Pauli helped Jung out with the idea. Synchronicity means some connection that happens without cause and effect, just happens between two things over a distance. And Pauli began to research the work of 2 astronomers, Kepler and Flood, who were not only interested in astronomy, but they were interested in symmetry, numerology, astrology. So he began to get into a little bit into the mystical side of history. He began to find Kepler's work, mystical work, just as interesting as his scientific work. And Kepler was a 17th century mathematician and astronomer who published some important work in astronomy that's scientifically valid, but also wrote a lot of stuff that was very mystical, that people just kind of look at, but they don't necessarily agree with. So Pauli made a connection between quantum physics because in his exclusion principle, you have symmetry, you have spin up is always balanced by spin down. And he began to look at numerology and mysticism as a way of connecting with that. He looked at ancient Greek writings, the Pythagoreans, who were very much into numbers, Eastern philosophy, things like Taoism, which has the yin and yang symbol. So this is a symbol from the Pythagoreans. Notice this, it's a symbol which has a triangle with 10 dots. 10 was a sacred number for the Pythagoreans. And it starts out with 4, 3, 2, 1. So you build up 10 with 1, 2, 3, 4. So the Pythagoreans felt that the first 4 numbers were sacred, and they built up their whole scheme in ancient Greek scheme through these numbers. They said that all is number. And that's something that Pauli started to get interested in. Maybe, since quantum physics is based on numbers, maybe there's something to it, what the Pythagoreans said. Well, the problem with adopting these numerological ideas is if you start taking them too seriously, you start to ignore experimentation. So you might be right or you might be wrong if you have these numerological ideas. Some of Pauli's ideas are right, some of them are wrong. So the Pythagoreans, for example, made predictions using the first numbers. They predicted the musical scale would sound good. They were right about that. They predicted because 10 is a sacred number, they predicted a planet that would travel on the other side of the sun called the counter Earth. that was wrong. Pauli studied Kepler's work, and he was interested in this model that Kepler had based upon the 5 Pythagorean solids that would explain how the universe worked. And that was a model that Kepler came up with that was based on geometry, but turned out to be incorrect. And Flood came up with a similar numerological interpretation. And both Pauli and Jung were interested in these ideas and discussed them. And here's a yin-yang symbol, another example of symmetry in Eastern philosophy. And finally, quantum entanglement, which is a valid use of symmetry to try to explain nature. So symmetry is part of physics. Sometimes symmetry can be misleading. Sometimes symmetry can lead to a deep truth. And the proof is in experimentation. So some aspects of quantum physics were predicted based upon symmetry, and they turn out to be right. Other predictions turn out to be wrong. Now, if you believe in acausal connections, you might ask the question, can information travel faster than light? And this is an age-old question that goes back once again to the ancient Greeks. The Greek philosopher Empedocles said that light from the sun must take time to reach Earth because everything must move through a particular part of space. So Empedocles believed that light travels with a certain speed. Now Aristotle, much later, said, no, we don't see light traveling in space from the sun, so therefore light must be instantaneous. So that started off a debate that lasted for millennia, whether or not the speed of light is infinite or finite. If the speed of light was infinite, then you could send a signal anywhere in the universe instantly. You could send a signal to another star instantly, and you wouldn't have to worry about cause and effect because the effect would happen instantly. But that's not what experiments have shown. Galileo, and this is sort of a depiction of that, tried to come up with a lantern experiment where 2 people stood on different hills. They would shine lanterns at each other, and by flashing the lanterns on and off, try to measure the speed of light. And Galileo couldn't quite get that to work, but he thought that if you could get that to work, you would show that the speed of light is finite, not infinite. And finally, in the 19th century, Albert Michelson did precision experiments showing that the speed of light travels at something like 186,000 miles per second. And you could also talk about it in meters per second, 3 times 10 to the 8th. But these are ways of characterizing the speed of light, and that it's not instantaneous. So light takes time to travel. So because of that, that means that cause and effect doesn't happen instantly. So information, only information that has been shared in a quantum state can travel faster than light. Information that is not already shared cannot be exchanged. So the difference between that is if you have electrons that are together and they're in the same quantum state, they somehow know about each other and they have a sharing of information. So even if you separate them, they still have access to the same information somehow. So if one is measured to be spin up, the other is measured to be spin down. But if you try to send information faster than light, you can't do that. You couldn't send a message faster than light. So Jung and Pauli decided to write a book together with two parts. The first part was on synchronicity, Jung's idea. The second part was on Pauli's work about Kepler and flood and ancient astronomical ideas. And once they wrote this book together, people began to realize that Pauli was Jung's patient who had all those dreams. Pauli helped Jung develop a diagram, which is a synchronicity diagram, where you have energy matched with time. This is in Einsteinian construction, energy, which is E equals mc squared, and then space-time, were the two things talked about by Einstein. Then add in causality, things that happen at the speed of light, cause and effect, and synchronicity, things that happen instantly. And Pauli came up with this version of the diagram for Jung. And this is to try to express their idea of how the universe is connected. Now, Pauli also believed in synchronicity in terms of coincidences in real life. And in fact, he told a story in which a patient had a dream about a golden scarab. And the patient was relating that dream. And then all of a sudden, Jung looked at the window, and there was a beetle, not a scarab, but a different kind of beetle, knocking on the window. And thought, well, that's kind of like a scarab, kind of like a golden scarab. And he felt that that was a meaningful coincidence. And Jung always told that story, often told that story. But these things happen to people all the time. But if you want to examine such things in real life scientifically, you have to, first of all, calculate the odds that any kind of coincidence would happen to you, not just something you're predicting. So if you said, I want to meet an insect or see an insect that has something to do with my dream, and you set off to sleep and have a dream, and then the next day you set off to look for the first thing you find in a room, and it happens to be an insect that you dreamed about, that would be pretty remarkable. But that's not what happens to people. People notice something and they say, hey, wait a minute, that's kind of a coincidence. But it's not something that they're predicting. It's something that is statistically likely to happen. Because if you live long enough, you interact with the world, things are going to happen which you have an association with. You have make some kind of association, because the brain is often looking for patterns. So the human brain tries to make connections with things. So if you are, for example, listening to a song and you're listening to certain lyrics, and sometimes lyrics are pretty common, and then you go outside and you happen to see something that matches one of the lyrics, if you listen to enough music, that's going to happen eventually. It might not happen every day, but it's going to happen eventually. And if you're particularly attuned to things like this, if you're very, very sensitive, then your brain is even more sensitized to coincidences, and then you're going to see them more often. So if you really believe in meaningful coincidences, you're going to find them more often than the average person, because you're going to be noticing them more often. But it's only science if you have objective experiments showing that something was extremely unlikely but happened anyway. And that hasn't been demonstrated. It's never been demonstrated that extremely unlikely things happen often to certain people. And science has shown that they're extremely unlikely, but certain people have those things anyway. If that were shown, then that would be remarkable, but it hasn't been shown. Now, Pauli thought one example of synchronicity in his life was something called the Pauli Effect, which was he had a penchant for destroying labs. And the Pauli effect was described by physicist George Gamow. The standing of a theoretical physicist is said to be measurable in terms of his ability to break delicate devices merely by touching them. By this standard, Wolfgang Pauli was a very good theoretical physicist. Apparatuses would fall, break, shatter, or burn when he merely walked into a lab. And Pauli began to believe that this was a real effect. It had some kind of strange property for destroying lab equipment, even if he wasn't in its vicinity. And one time, legend has it, he was traveling by train through the town of Göttingen, Germany, and equipment suddenly exploded for no reason at the university. Another time, he was in Princeton, and the cyclotron had a big fire. He wasn't in the lab, but the fire burned in the basement for more than 6 hours. Major fire at Princeton. Now, these were coincidences, but Pauli thought it was real. Now, in 1948, Jung opened an institute in Switzerland near Zurich to promote his ideas called depth psychology. He invited Pauli to attend the opening ceremony. Pauli arrived, and suddenly there was a loud crash without any reason. A Chinese vase dropped off a shelf, fell to the floor, smashed into smithereens, and there was a flood of water on the floor. Pauli thought, well, must be me. I'm the jinx. Pauli effect. And then it hit him. There's a flood of water, and he was studying the astronomer Robert Fludd, and that caused a flood. So that's where his studies of Robert Fludd got him, that a flood of water on the floor of the Jung Institute. Now, luckily, the Institute remained intact and didn't burn down. I visited the Institute about a year ago, last September, and this is the way it looked like a year ago. That's where Jungian studies are still being promoted. And nearby is Jung's beautiful lakeside home, which is open to the public by reservation. I highly recommend it. And that's where Jung sometimes met with Pauli, his beautiful lakeside home near Zurich. Now, they continued a correspondence until about 1957. Suddenly, Pauli became very skeptical. One of the people that corresponded with is J.B. Rhine, an American researcher at Duke, who did these psychic experiments. And Pauli began to doubt the validity of the psychic experiments and wrote a letter to Rhine. But Rhine got the letter for some reason. The mail was delayed and didn't get the letter until after Pauli had already died. Rhine was very disturbed that Pauli had become a non-believer in these psychic ideas. But Pauli did note his hospital room where he died was a number of significance in physics, number 137, which has significance in particle physics. So synchronicity is of interest to me for a historical reason, and also because quantum entanglement has acausal connections. So Jung was prescient in saying that we need to delve into acausal as well as causal connections in the universe. But I believe that Jung was not correct in saying that coincidences in people's lives have to do with synchronicity, because the brain has a penchant for finding patterns. We find things that seem improbable but are actually very likely. Like if you're in a room with 23 or more people, it's more likely than not that two people will share the same birthday. And if you were in a room with 30 people and you met someone who had the same birthday as you, you might be like, wow, synchronicity, but it might be more likely than not that two people would share the same birthday. So you must use statistical analysis with a large sample size to validate any claim. So if you find yourself dreaming about a train on a magnetic levitation train, and the magnetic levitation train runs by superconductivity, which is a quantum physics property, then it's the train's mechanics, its dynamics, which is synchronous because of quantum physics, not the fact that you dream about a train and then you're on a train. That is not necessarily an unlikely thing to happen. So that's my talk. And please pick up a copy of my book. They're available at any store, online store. You can get them online through any bookseller. And recently I autographed some copies at a store in Pennsylvania called Main Point Books. They probably still have some autographed copies if you want to order through them. Or you can order copies through Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, Powell Books, IndieBound, Bookshop.com. A lot of online booksellers have the book. There's also an audiobook version, and there are electronic versions if you're interested. So please pick up a copy. And if you don't purchase through a place where I've already autographed books, you're welcome to mail me a copy with a self-addressed stamped envelope to my work address at University of the Sciences, and I'd be glad to sign the copy and send it back to you. But you need to supply the postage. So thank you very much to the LVH, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions now that you have. So let me, let's see. Switch to me.
That was very interesting.
Great, thank you. So are there any questions?
If anyone wants to raise their hand, we can try to keep people from talking over each other. Brian?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the talk, Paul. Very, very interesting. I have lots of questions, actually, but let me kind of distill one out of my thoughts. And it seems like your discussion centers very much around traditional physics meets psychological phenomena. So I don't know if you'd want to comment maybe on your thoughts on other kind of connections. I mean, what comes to mind is like the Deepak Chopra kind of quantum, kind of, I guess he's more of a pseudoscience kind of thing. Or more recently, there's been a lot of discussion of panpsychism, which is kind of the idea that there might be a quantum measure of consciousness. Any thoughts on those two kind of ideas?
Well, so first of all, yeah, my book addresses there's a third element. There's traditional physics, classical physics, there's quantum physics, and there's psychology. So traditional physics and quantum physics are very different, but then the connection with psychology for either of them is unclear. Now, there are legitimate efforts to try to understand consciousness. Now, to me, consciousness is a great mystery, because how can you try to scientifically quantify a feeling that you exist? So, like, how can you say, okay, these variables click into place, here's the equation, and because of this equation, we know that somebody says, I exist. So it's a big mystery why people have the feeling that they exist. I don't really think science can really explain that right now. Now, physicists such as Roger Penrose tried to understand consciousness as a quantum phenomenon, certain quantum transitions that happen in the brain or happen in cells. So there have been some efforts, but neuroscientists, for the most part, dismiss these efforts and haven't really found clear connections between quantum physics and consciousness so far. Now, of course, people can map out other kinds of effects on the brain. It's very easy to say, okay, people are thinking about something or using language, and certain parts of the brain have more electrical activity. So you can talk about electrical activity in the brain and try to develop a model for that. But, it's hard to say, what is the activity when people are expressing their conscious awareness. So consciousness seems to have a different quality than, let's say, using language, or let's say moving your hand or something like that. Seems to be more scientifically explainable. So in terms of the work of Deepak Chopra and the other panpsychism, I'm not really addressing those in my work. I'm more interested in, first of all, how to explain quantum physics and what's the connection with classical physics. And then in terms of the psychology, I'm more interested in it from a historical point of view. Why do physicists turn to psychology? Why did psychologists turn to physics?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Go ahead.
Okay. Have you read any of the work of H.P. Stapp? He wrote some papers. I came across them in the early 90s. They seem to talk about quantum mechanics as kind of a loophole around determinism and free will and consciousness and so on. Do you have any opinion about?
Well, a lot of the quantum thinkers, I haven't read that particular author, but a lot of the quantum thinkers thought that quantum mechanics did offer a loophole about a free will. Now, for example, Max Born, who was a friend of Einstein and one of the early developers of quantum physics, in fact, he coined the term quantum mechanics. Max Born argued vehemently with Einstein, like, why do you keep saying, like, God does not play dice with the universe? And Born was not religious at all, and Born thought, well, why would you want to have a being, even in a non-personal being, which is what Einstein believed, sort of a non-personal entity, determining the future of the universe? That seemed almost totalitarian to him. So Born would use terms like authoritarian or totalitarian to describe like a divine being that could predict the whole future. And rather, he believed that free will was much more open, and that it meant that people can pretty much decide whatever they wanted. So he used quantum mechanics as a way of arguing, well, since there's chance in quantum mechanics, we don't really know what someone will be thinking next. He didn't equate the two, but he said, look, free will remains open, an open question. Okay. Any other questions?
I had one. So Pauli and Jung had a professional relationship. Did they know each other personally as well? Were they contact each other for birthdays, or was it strictly a
As I mentioned, originally, Pauli wrote to Jung as a therapist. So originally, Pauli was interested in Jung just as for therapeutic reasons, and then Jung assigned his assistant to work with Pauli, and then later they had some therapeutic context. They corresponded with each other. They didn't really meet socially, but they met for social events connected with professional things. For example, the opening of the Institute. So Pauli was on Jung's list for, VIPs to invite to events, but they wouldn't hang out, and shoot the breeze or whatever. They wouldn't go go out with friends or something. They had a professional relationship in that sense.
There's another number of people. Oh, sorry, Brian. There's a number of people who don't have cameras. Do any of you want to ask a question? Nope. All right, then Brian, it's on you.
Yeah, my other thought, and again, maybe this isn't so much on the psychology side, but when you were mentioning phenomena that are limited by the speed of light, I'm wondering if the recent evidence behind gravitational waves, has that put any, is there any stock in that being an entangled event versus one that would be limited by the speed of light? And this maybe the same, you might comment on the simulation hypothesis, which I know is a little bit more far out, but any evidence that you've stumbled in your research that supports that, or is that just a totally zany hypothesis?
Okay. Well, those are two very different questions, two very good questions. But gravitational waves have been shown to travel exactly at the speed of light, which was Einstein's prediction for their speed. But that's been borne out because there have been some events where, for example, neutron stars collide and produce gravitational waves, and you can actually see radio signals from the neutron stars from their collision. So you see electromagnetic radiation, which is essentially light, traveling at the speed of light. And then you say, well, when do we receive the gravitational waves? And the answer is, even though these objects are billions of light years away, we receive the signals exactly at the same time. And that was shown even earlier, well, not with gravitational waves, but with neutrinos are also produced at such events, and they travel close to the speed of light, if not almost exactly the speed of light. So, so gravitational waves are not an example of entanglement. However, people believe that if quantum mechanics applies to everything, then eventually we'll be able to show that that gravitational waves are quantized. And if they are quantized, then technically you could have a situation of entanglement. But we're long ways away from that because we've just been able to see classical gravitational waves. If gravitational waves were quantized, you would have to show that their energy comes in packets, that they're not a continuous flow of energy. But right now we see a flow of energy. Okay, so anyway, and then in terms of simulation, the simulation hypothesis, I'm not really sure where that comes from, but there's some people who speculate that everything in the universe is a simulation by some intelligent beings. I'm not sure why we would believe that, because then why wouldn't the situation they're in, be a simulation too? So I don't really give much credence to the simulation hypothesis.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll ask one more if no one else is going to ask. So, what is your next book, or what is on the fringe of the future of physics that you think is exciting?
I'm working on a new project. I'm not ready to announce it yet, but I will announce it. A new book project. I'll announce the topic once. Usually I wait till the book is completely finished before announcing it, but I'm also working on articles. I'm working on a book chapter in a book about experimental verification of general relativity. So that book chapter, the book has been a little bit on hold because of the pandemic, because people couldn't really do much research. But now hopefully research libraries will be open soon, so I'll be able to look at the John Wheeler papers at the American Philosophical Society and do some research on that, and for my book chapter. I'm also teaching some courses in person, small groups, which has been fun to be back at the university and teach. So I have a lot on my plate right now. So thank you.
Dave, did you have a question?
Are we on?
Yeah, no, we're on.
Yeah, since nobody else did, I thought I might as well. What I learned from my BS in physics, which is pretty low, is that it's mathematics applied to physical events with boundary conditions. And it never really proposes an answer to things that are non-scientific in that sense. It's only saying this happens and we can predict it with this mathematical model within boundary conditions. And I think the great minds like Einstein also had input from other sources that allowed them to cycle through different concepts and mathematical models. And there's a thing called the most elegant solution to problems. And it's almost an aesthetic concept as well as a scientific concept. So that solutions are beautiful as well as scientific. There are several ways to represent things mathematically that do the same thing, but one is more elegant than the other. So I can only see a relationship between us trying to study our own mind and us trying to study how to define our physical universe in that sense. But I've been reading a lot of Emerson lately because my grandfather has this collection of all of Emerson's works. And Emerson is essentially saying that the result of Darwinism is beautiful, and we should be constantly looking for this best of all possible worlds. But Darwinism really isn't really that. Darwinism is just predicting that things are getting more complicated, not necessarily better.
Right.
And you know, those kinds of things are just non-scientific, and they always will be. Mm-hmm. But there will be contributions, just like music is a contribution to what we know. And it's just a little bit different from the scientific what we know. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think
back to the conversation.
I think you hit the nail on the head that there's science and there's interpretation of science. So Newtonian physics stated certain laws and said, well, you can use these laws to predict things. And then people came along and said, hey, wait a minute, we can apply that to the mind or apply that to everything. But Newton never said that. It was more of an interpretation. And the same thing with Darwin, that people took Darwin's idea of natural selection and Darwin's evolutionary idea and then said, okay, well, let's apply that to sociology. Let's apply that to psychology. Let's apply it to politics, places where Darwin had not intended it to be applied. So you have to be careful with any science, find the domain in which it's applicable. And quantum physics notoriously has been misapplied to all sorts of places that it shouldn't have been applied to. Quantum physics governs the subatomic world, transitions between electrons. But then people say, well, and if an electron has a 50-50 chance to be in a certain place, and we don't know for sure, then that means that we can predict or create our own future, because we don't know for sure what's going to happen to us. So that means that if we think positively, it will give one outcome. If we think negatively, it will give another outcome. Well, that has those positive and negative thinking things have nothing to do with quantum physics. People just misapply quantum physics to day-to-day life, and and of course, my story about Jung and Pauli was a good example of that, where they were trying to say, well, how does quantum physics, how does that relate to the coincidence that you dream about something and then you see, something from your dreams? Well, quantum physics doesn't have anything to do with that.
Anyone else have a question?
Yeah, Bill, this is Butch. If I can ask Paul questions, first of all, thank you for giving this talk. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm a little curious. I think it was, you said Pauli changed his attitude towards the pseudoscience and became more skeptical later in life. I'm wondering if there was anything that happened to him that caused that.
So that's a bit of a mystery. Pauli was, I said, very hard-headed and very cynical, very critical. So something happened that made him, in his final 2 years of life, so he died in 1958, go back to thinking more about physics and become less interested in this parapsychology stuff. And it's really unclear. He also started getting a little bit grumpier around that time. Maybe he just began to become more skeptical about a lot of things in his life. So he stopped toward the last year of his life. He didn't really correspond with Jung as much. As I mentioned, he wrote that critical letter to J.B. Rhine. And at the same time, he was starting to get more involved in physics again. Now, I guess I could point to one thing that made him cynical, and that's that he was a big believer in symmetry. And there was an experiment in 1957 that showed that there was a way that symmetry did not hold in the particle world, that something was broken. Symmetry was broken in the particle world, meaning it didn't apply exactly. And now those were experiments done by a physicist named C.S. Wu, showing that certain particle decays did not look the same if they happened. If you looked at them in the mirror, they didn't look exactly the same, that they weren't exactly mirror image reflections of each other. So you could have two particle decays that happened that didn't look exactly the same as reflected in the mirror. And that's called parity violation, or parity symmetry violation. And Pauli was taken aback that there could be something in nature that doesn't have symmetries, and maybe that made him more cynical. But we really don't know why he became so cynical in his last 2 years. And then he died at a relatively young age in 1958. He was only in his late 50s. And so we really don't know how he would have been if he had lived longer. Any other questions?
Last chance.
Paul, you mentioned you're working on another project. Do you have an idea, a timeline on how long that'll be so that we can have you back again?
Well, as I said, I'm working on a new book, but I'd be glad to come back again once the new book is published, but no definitive announcement yet of the topic or the publication date and so forth, because right now I'm focusing on getting the word out about my book, Synchronicity. But I'll be glad to come back again, hopefully in person. So I'll be glad to see you all in person sometime in the future.
That would be really great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I guess we're done then.
Great.
Thank you, Paul, for
Thanks again.
attending.
Great being here. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the invitation.